The morning fog clung to Chicago's streets like a shroud, muffling the clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant whistle of steamboats on Lake Michigan. Thomas Hartford adjusted his leather satchel, heavy with photographic plates and equipment, as he made his way through the bustling crowds toward Union Station. The year 1903 had brought unprecedented growth to the city, and today marked the grand opening of the station's newest platform, a marvel of engineering that would accommodate the ever-increasing flow of passengers traveling west. Thomas had been commissioned by the Chicago Tribune to document this historic day, an assignment that would pay handsomely and potentially secure his reputation as one of the city's premier photographers. At 32, he had already made a name for himself capturing the raw energy of Chicago's reconstruction after the Great Fire, but railway photography offered new opportunities in a rapidly expanding industry. The station buzzed with excitement despite the early hour. Well-dressed passengers mingled with railway officials, their breath visible in the crisp October air that seeped through the massive glass ceiling. Thomas set up his equipment near the new platform, his practiced hands assembling the large-format camera, with its brass fittings gleaming under the electric lights, still a novelty in many parts of the city. "Quite a turnout for such an early ceremony," remarked a voice behind him. Thomas turned to see a distinguished gentleman in a wool coat, his graying beard neatly trimmed, and a gold pocket watch chain visible across his vest. "Indeed, sir. Progress waits for no one in Chicago," Thomas replied, adjusting his camera's focus. "Thomas Hartford, photographer for the Tribune. Charles Brennan, station manager." The man introduced himself with a firm handshake. "We're expecting the inaugural train from Milwaukee any moment now. Should make for some fine photographs." As if summoned by their conversation, a uniformed conductor approached with hurried steps, his face flushed with concern. "Mr. Brennan, sir, I'm afraid there's been a delay. Mechanical troubles about 20 miles north. The train won't arrive for at least 3 hours." Brennan's composed demeanor faltered momentarily. 3 hours? We have over 200 people waiting here, including city officials and investors. Thomas seized the opportunity. "Perhaps I could capture some photographs of the waiting crowd. Document the anticipation, the grandeur of the new platform. It might make for an even more compelling story." Brennan nodded absently, already calculating the implications of the delay. Yes, of course. Do whatever you need, Mr. Hartford." The photographer moved through the crowd with purpose, his trained eye seeking composition and light. The autumn morning cast long shadows through the station's windows, creating dramatic contrasts perfect for his artistic vision. He captured groups of passengers reading newspapers, children pressed against windows watching for the delayed train, and elegant ladies in their finest traveling attire checking ornate timepieces. As the hours passed, the crowd's initial excitement gave way to restless murmuring. Some passengers departed for other trains, while others settled in for the extended wait. Thomas continued his work methodically, changing plates and adjusting his equipment as the light shifted throughout the morning. Near noon, with the crowd at its densest, Thomas positioned himself at the far end of the platform for a wide shot that would capture the full scope of the gathering. Through his viewfinder, he framed the scene carefully. The ornate iron pillars, the waiting passengers, the play of light and shadow that gave the station its cathedral-like atmosphere. He pressed the shutter release, holding perfectly still as the mechanism clicked and the plate captured its image. Something felt different about this particular photograph, though he couldn't quite identify what. Perhaps it was the quality of light, or the way the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath in that frozen moment. "Beautiful shot," came a voice from beside him. Thomas turned to see a young woman with kind eyes and a slight smile, her dark hair pinned beneath a modest hat. "You have quite an artistic eye, Mr. Hartford." Thomas felt a chill despite the crowded warmth of the station. He was certain no one had been standing near him when he took the photograph, and something about the woman seemed oddly out of place, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what troubled him. "Thank you, miss, I didn't catch your name." But when he looked again, she was gone, disappeared into the crowd as mysteriously as she had appeared. Thomas shook his head, attributing the strange encounter to the stress of the long morning and the pressure of documenting such an important event. Finally, at 2:30 in the afternoon, the delayed train's whistle echoed through the station, and the crowd surged forward with renewed energy. Thomas captured the locomotive's majestic arrival, the billowing steam, and the joyous faces of passengers and officials alike. The ceremony proceeded without further incident, speeches were made, and the first passengers boarded for their journey west. As evening approached and the crowds dispersed, Thomas packed his equipment with satisfaction. He had captured not just the planned ceremony, but the human drama of waiting, anticipation, and finally, fulfillment. The unexpected delay had provided him with a richer story than he had originally hoped for. Walking back to his hotel through the gaslit streets, Thomas looked forward to developing his photographs. He had a feeling that today's work would be among his finest, particularly that one shot of the waiting crowd when the light had been just perfect and time seemed suspended in the station's grand hall. He had no way of knowing that within those captured moments lay something that would challenge everything he believed about life, death, and the thin veil that separates the two worlds. The Palmer House Hotel stood as one of Chicago's crown jewels, its opulent lobby a testament to the city's rapid ascension from frontier town to industrial powerhouse. Thomas had chosen this establishment not for its luxury, but for its modern amenities, including running water and gas lighting that made it ideal for his photographic work. In his third-floor room, he had converted the small adjoining chamber into a makeshift darkroom, complete with developing trays and the chemical solutions necessary for his craft. The amber glow of the safety lamp cast eerie shadows as Thomas worked methodically through the evening hours. One by one, he immersed the glass plates in developer, watching as ghostly images slowly materialized like spirits emerging from another realm. The portraits of railway officials came first, stiff, formal poses that would satisfy the Tribune's need for documentary evidence of the day's events. Next came the candid shots of the waiting passengers. Thomas smiled as faces emerged from the chemical bath, a young boy pressing his nose against the window, an elderly gentleman consulting his pocket watch with evident frustration, a group of society ladies maintaining their composure despite the delay. These human moments would add depth to his story, showing not just the grandeur of progress, but its impact on ordinary people. As midnight approached, Thomas reached for the plate containing his wide-angle shot of the entire crowd, the photograph he had taken when the mysterious woman had complimented his work. He slipped the glass negative into the developer, swirling the solution gently as he had done thousands of times before. The image began to emerge slowly, the familiar process made magical by years of practice. The station's architecture appeared first, the soaring iron framework, the ornate details that spoke of American ambition and engineering prowess. Then came the crowd, a sea of faces and forms captured in that perfect moment of anticipation. Thomas leaned closer, studying the composition with a photographer's critical eye. The lighting had indeed been exceptional, creating depth and drama throughout the frame, but as he examined the faces more closely, something made his blood run cold. There, in the left portion of the photograph, stood a woman in dark traveling attire. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, her expression serene yet somehow urgent. Thomas recognized her immediately. It was the woman who had spoken to him about his artistic eye, the one who had vanished so mysteriously into the crowd. But that wasn't what sent ice through his veins. Thomas had worked for the Chicago Tribune long enough to recognize faces that appeared regularly in their pages. This woman was Margaret Whitmore, the young schoolteacher who had died in a horrific train accident 6 months earlier. He had photographed her funeral for the newspaper, had seen her coffin lowered into the ground at Graceland Cemetery. Thomas stumbled backward, knocking over a bottle of fixer solution. The chemical spread across his makeshift workbench, filling the small room with its acrid smell. His hands trembled as he lifted the plate closer to the amber light, praying that his eyes had deceived him, but there was no mistake. Margaret Whitmore stood clearly visible among the living passengers, her image as sharp and detailed as anyone else in the photograph. Her dark dress, the particular way she held her gloved hands, the distinctive cameo brooch at her throat, every detail matched the woman he remembered from that terrible day in April, when her body had been recovered from the twisted wreckage near Lake Forest. Impossible, Thomas whispered to the empty room. He had been photographing Chicago for over a decade, had seen his share of double exposures and chemical accidents that could create false images, but this was different. Margaret appeared naturally integrated into the scene, casting a proper shadow, positioned correctly in relation to the other figures around her. Thomas sat heavily on the wooden chair he used for long developing sessions, his mind racing through possible explanations. Could it be someone who merely resembled Margaret? The thought offered momentary comfort until he remembered the woman's voice, the way she had spoken his name, though he was certain they had never been introduced. He reached for the Tribune's morgue files he kept in his hotel room for reference, yellowed clippings and photographs from stories past. With shaking fingers, he found the article about Margaret's death, published on April 15, 1903. The headline read, "Local teacher dies in railway disaster. Mechanical failure claims young life." The accompanying photograph showed Margaret in life, her kind eyes and gentle smile radiating the warmth that had made her beloved by students and colleagues alike. Thomas held the newspaper clipping beside his glass plate, comparing the features. There could be no doubt. They were the same woman. But Margaret Whitmore was dead. Thomas had photographed her funeral service at St. Mary's Cathedral, had watched as hundreds of mourners paid their respects to a life cut tragically short. Her death had been one of those senseless tragedies that reminded everyone of progress's hidden costs. A young woman traveling to visit her sister, killed when a supposedly routine journey turned deadly due to mechanical failure. Thomas read the article again, searching for details he might have forgotten. The accident had occurred on a rainy evening in April, when the northbound express to Milwaukee had suffered a catastrophic brake failure. Margaret had been in the first passenger car when the train derailed at a curve near Lake Forest, her body found among the wreckage hours later. The railway company had issued the usual statements about safety improvements and mechanical inspections, but within weeks, the story had faded from public attention. Chicago in 1903 was a city focused on the future, not dwelling on individual tragedies when there was so much progress to be made. Yet here she was, standing among the living in his photograph, her presence as real and undeniable as the iron pillars of Union Station itself. Thomas carefully placed the developed plate in his storage rack, his hands still trembling from the discovery. As he cleaned up the spilled chemicals and prepared to retire for the night, questions swirled through his mind like the fog that had shrouded the city that morning. What did Margaret's appearance mean? Was it merely his imagination, a trick of light and shadow that his grief-trained eye had interpreted as something supernatural? But even as Thomas tried to rationalize what he had seen, he knew with growing certainty that Margaret Whitmore had returned for a purpose. The dead, he was beginning to understand, sometimes had unfinished business among the living, and somehow through his camera lens he had become witness to that impossible return. Thomas spent a sleepless night staring at the hotel room ceiling. The image of Margaret Whitmore burned into his mind like an overexposed photograph. By dawn, he had convinced himself that exhaustion and suggestion had played tricks on him. Perhaps the stress of the assignment, combined with his familiarity with Margaret's tragic story, had caused him to see what wasn't there. But when he returned to his makeshift darkroom in the pale morning light, the photograph told the same impossible story. Margaret stood clearly among the living, her presence undeniable and inexplicable. Thomas dressed quickly and made his way to the Tribune offices on Madison Street, where the morning bustle of reporters and typesetters provided a welcome return to the rational world. He found his editor, James Morrison, hunched over galley proofs with his characteristic scowl of concentration. "Hartford, how did the railway photographs turn out? We need something spectacular for tomorrow's edition." "They're quite good, sir, but I need to ask you about something." Thomas hesitated, uncertain how to broach such an unusual subject. "The Margaret Whitmore story from last April. Do you recall the specific details?" Morrison looked up sharply, his steel-grey eyes narrowing. "Strange thing to ask about. Why the sudden interest in old news?" "Professional curiosity. I'm working on a piece about railway safety, and her case seemed particularly tragic." Morrison leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his considerable weight. "Margaret Whitmore was more than tragic, son. She was suspicious. That whole accident stank to high heaven, but we could never prove anything." "What do you mean, suspicious?" The editor glanced around the newsroom, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, that brake failure wasn't as random as the railway company claimed. Margaret had been asking questions about safety violations, writing letters to city officials about dangerous conditions she'd observed during her regular travels to see her sister." Thomas felt a chill despite the warmth of the crowded office. What kind of safety violations? Faulty brake systems, overloaded cars, tracks that hadn't been properly maintained. Margaret was a schoolteacher, but she was also smart and observant. She'd started documenting problems, taking notes during her monthly trips north. Morrison pulled a thick file from his desk drawer, yellowed clippings and handwritten notes spilling from its contents. "We received several letters from her in the weeks before her death. She claimed to have evidence that the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad was cutting corners on safety to maximize profits." "Evidence? What kind of evidence?" "We never found out. After the accident, her personal effects were supposedly destroyed in the wreckage. The railway company was remarkably efficient in clearing the scene and disposing of the debris, almost suspiciously so. Thomas examined the file, noting Margaret's neat handwriting on several letters addressed to the Tribune. Her concerns were methodical and well documented, a teacher's careful approach to gathering evidence. She had observed repeated mechanical problems, witnessed conductors ignoring safety protocols, and noticed an alarming pattern of near accidents that were dismissed by railway officials. "Why didn't you pursue the story?" Morrison's expression darkened. "We tried, believe me, but the railway has powerful friends in this city. Our publisher received some very persuasive visits from prominent businessmen who suggested that dwelling on such matters might be bad for Chicago's growth and progress. So the story was buried. Like Margaret herself, poor girl was trying to save lives, and it probably cost her own." Thomas spent the morning reading through Margaret's correspondence, each letter revealing a woman of remarkable courage and determination. She had been fighting a dangerous battle against powerful interests, armed only with her observations and an unwavering sense of moral responsibility. Her final letter, dated just 3 days before her death, was particularly chilling. "Mr. Morrison, I have discovered something that proves criminal negligence in the railway's maintenance practices. I will bring the evidence to your office upon my return from Milwaukee. The traveling public deserves to know the truth about the dangers they face every time they board these trains." That evidence had died with her, or so it seemed. Thomas returned to his hotel that afternoon with a growing sense of purpose. If Margaret Whitmore had appeared in his photograph, perhaps it was because her work remained unfinished. Perhaps the dead, when justice had been denied them, found ways to reach across the veil and demand accountability. He studied the photograph again with new eyes, noting details he had missed before. Margaret wasn't simply standing among the crowd. She appeared to be looking directly at his camera, as if she knew she was being captured for posterity. Her expression held a subtle urgency, a plea for recognition that transcended the boundaries between life and death. As evening approached, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of his investigation and possibly his life. He would visit Graceland Cemetery, where Margaret lay buried, and see if her grave might hold clues to the mystery surrounding her supernatural appearance. The cemetery gates stood open despite the late hour, their iron scrollwork casting intricate shadows in the gaslight. Thomas made his way through the winding paths, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the gravel walkways. October's chill had stripped most of the leaves from the ancient oaks, their bare branches reaching toward a star-filled sky like skeletal fingers. Margaret's grave was simple but well-maintained, marked by a modest headstone that bore her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved teacher and daughter." Fresh flowers lay at its base, unusual for someone who had been dead for 6 months. Thomas knelt beside the grave, studying the wilted bouquet. The flowers were recent, perhaps placed within the last few days. Someone still mourned Margaret Whitmore, still remembered her enough to brave the cemetery's nighttime atmosphere. "Who's visiting you, Margaret?" he whispered to the stone. "And why did you appear in my photograph?" A sudden gust of wind rustled through the cemetery, stirring the dead leaves around her grave. In that moment, Thomas could have sworn he heard a voice carried on the October air, soft, feminine, and heartbreakingly familiar. "The truth," it seemed to whisper. "Find the truth." Thomas rose quickly, his heart pounding. The rational part of his mind insisted that wind through bare branches could create auditory illusions, but his photographer's instincts told him otherwise. He had learned to trust those instincts over years of capturing fleeting moments and hidden truths. Margaret Whitmore was trying to communicate with him, using his camera as a bridge between the world of the living and whatever realm claimed the dead. Her unfinished business remained as urgent in death as it had been in life, and somehow Thomas had become her unwitting ally in seeking the justice that had been denied her. As he walked back through the cemetery gates, Thomas realized that his simple assignment to photograph a railway ceremony had evolved into something far more significant and dangerous. He was now investigating not just a supernatural mystery, but a potential conspiracy that had claimed at least one life and threatened countless others. The dead, it seemed, made powerful allies when the cause was just. The next morning brought a cold drizzle that seemed to seep into Thomas's bones as he made his way north to Evanston, where Margaret's sister Catherine lived. He had found her address in the Tribune's files, and something told him that she might hold the key to understanding Margaret's posthumous appearance. The Whitmore family home was a modest Victorian cottage on a tree-lined street, its painted shutters and well-tended garden speaking of middle-class respectability. Thomas stood before the front door for several minutes, rehearsing how he might explain his unusual visit without sounding like a madman. The woman who answered his knock bore a striking resemblance to Margaret, though her eyes held a wariness that spoke of recent tragedy. Catherine Whitmore was perhaps 5 years older than her deceased sister, with the same delicate features but a more guarded expression. "Miss Whitmore? I'm Thomas Hartford from the Chicago Tribune. I was hoping to speak with you about your sister Margaret." Catherine's face immediately clouded with suspicion. "The newspaper already wrote about Margaret months ago. Why are you here now?" "I'm investigating some irregularities in railway safety practices, and Margaret's correspondence with our paper suggests she had important information about dangerous conditions. I was hoping you might know something about her research." For a moment, Catherine seemed ready to close the door. Then her shoulders sagged slightly, and she stepped aside to let him enter. "Come in, Mr. Hartford, but I warn you, if you're here to write sensational stories about my sister's death, you'll find yourself back on the street very quickly." The cottage's interior was warm and inviting, filled with the kind of personal touches that spoke of a life well lived. Photographs of the Whitmore sisters adorned the mantelpiece, showing them at various stages of life, as children in matching dresses, as young women at graduation ceremonies, and finally as adults sharing holidays and special occasions. "Margaret visited you regularly, didn't she?" Thomas asked, accepting the cup of tea Catherine offered. "Once a month, usually. She would take the train up on Saturday mornings and return Sunday evening. We were very close, especially after our parents died." Catherine's voice carried a mix of fondness and pain that made Thomas's heart ache. He could see the genuine love between the sisters, which made Margaret's death even more tragic. "Did she ever mention concerns about the railway safety practices during those visits?" Catherine set down her teacup with a sharp clink. "Mr. Hartford, my sister died because that railway company cared more about profits than passenger safety. But proving that is another matter entirely." "What do you mean?" Catherine rose and walked to a small writing desk near the window. After a moment's hesitation, she withdrew a key from her dress pocket and unlocked one of the drawers. From it, she pulled a leather portfolio tied with a black ribbon. "Margaret left this with me during her final visit. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should make sure it reached the right people. But after her death, I didn't know who to trust." Thomas's pulse quickened as Catherine placed the portfolio on the table between them. "What's in it?" "See for yourself, Mr. Hartford. But understand that opening this makes you a part of something that got my sister killed." With trembling hands, Thomas untied the ribbon and opened the portfolio. Inside were dozens of pages covered in Margaret's careful handwriting, along with what appeared to be official railway documents, maintenance reports, and correspondence between company officials. The first page was dated 2 months before Margaret's death. Documentation of safety violations, Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, compiled by M. Whitmore for public safety. As Thomas read through the materials, a picture of systematic negligence and deliberate cover-ups emerged. Margaret had somehow obtained internal railway documents showing that mechanical inspections were being falsified, that brake systems were failing at an alarming rate, and that company officials were aware of the problems but chose to ignore them rather than face the expense of proper repairs. One memo, dated just weeks before her death, was particularly damning. It came from the railway's chief engineer to the board of directors. While the brake failures represent a statistical concern, the cost of systematic replacement would significantly impact quarterly profits. Recommend continued operation with increased insurance coverage to handle potential liability claims. "Dear God," Thomas whispered. "They knew people would die." Catherine nodded grimly. Margaret discovered that several recent accidents, including 2 fatalities in the past year, were directly related to problems the company knew about but chose to ignore. She was planning to take this evidence to federal authorities. How did she obtain these documents? She had a friend who worked in the railway offices, someone who shared her concerns about passenger safety but was too frightened to speak out directly. Thomas studied the documents more carefully, noting official stamps and signatures that proved their authenticity. This wasn't hearsay or speculation. It was concrete evidence of criminal negligence that could have sent company executives to prison. "Why haven't you come forward with this before now?" Catherine's laugh was bitter. "Come forward to whom?" "The railway company has friends throughout the city government, the police department, even the courts." A week after Margaret's funeral, I received a visit from two very polite gentlemen who suggested that dwelling on the past might be unhealthy for my future employment prospects. They threatened you. Not in so many words, but the message was clear enough. Our schoolteacher's salary doesn't leave much room for taking on powerful interests, especially when those interests have the resources to destroy your reputation and livelihood. Thomas felt anger building in his chest, not just at the railway company's callous disregard for human life, but at the systematic intimidation that had silenced those who might have sought justice for Margaret and other victims. Miss Whitmore, I believe your sister is trying to reach us from beyond the grave. I know how that sounds, but I have photographic evidence that suggests Margaret's spirit is still fighting for the truth she died trying to expose. Catherine stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You photographed Margaret? Thomas nodded, pulling out a print of the station photograph he had made that morning. She appears here among the living passengers, as clear as anyone else in the image. Catherine took the photograph with hands that shook slightly. When she found Margaret's figure in the crowd, tears began streaming down her cheeks. That's her dress, the one she was buried in. She wore it on special occasions, said it made her feel confident and strong. She spoke to me at the station, though I didn't recognize her at the time. She complimented my photography, then vanished into the crowd. What did her voice sound like? Thomas described Margaret's soft, cultured tones and the warmth in her expression. Catherine nodded through her tears. That was Margaret exactly. She always had a kind word for everyone's work, always saw the best in people. Catherine looked up at Thomas with new determination in her eyes. If my sister has found a way to reach across death itself to continue her fight for justice, then perhaps it's time I stopped being afraid of what the railway company might do to me. What are you saying? I'm saying, Mr. Hartford, that Margaret's evidence needs to see the light of day, and if you're truly willing to help her spirit find peace, then we have work to do. As thunder rumbled outside and rain began pelting the cottage windows, Thomas realized that he had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Margaret Whitmore's ghost had drawn him into a battle between the living and the dead, between justice and corruption, between truth and the powerful forces that sought to bury it along with their victims. The investigation was about to become much more dangerous, and Thomas was no longer certain whether he was helping a ghost find peace or being pulled deeper into the supernatural realm where Margaret's restless spirit dwelt. Armed with Margaret's damning evidence, Thomas returned to Chicago with a sense of purpose that bordered on obsession. The rain that had begun in Evanston followed him south, turning the city's streets into rivers of mud and making the gas lamps flicker like dying stars through the gloom. Back at the Tribune offices, Thomas spread Margaret's documents across his desk, studying each page with the meticulous attention he usually reserved for examining photographic negatives. The scope of the railway company's negligence was staggering. Dozens of safety violations, falsified inspection reports, and a pattern of deliberate deception that stretched back years. One document particularly caught his attention. A letter from Railway Inspector Benjamin Clark to the company's board of directors, dated 3 weeks before Margaret's death. Clark had documented multiple brake system failures and warned that catastrophic accidents were inevitable without immediate action. The board's response was a terse memo ordering Clark to revise his report to reflect more optimistic safety projections. Thomas recognized Clark's name from Tribune archives. The inspector had died in a suspicious house fire just 2 weeks after Margaret's accident. At the time, it had seemed like an unfortunate coincidence. Now Thomas began to see a more sinister pattern. Working late again, Hartford? James Morrison's gravelly voice made Thomas jump. The editor stood in the newsroom doorway, his coat dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor. Jim, I need to show you something. Something about the Margaret Whitmore case. Morrison approached cautiously, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the official nature of the documents spread across Thomas's desk. Where did you get these? Margaret's sister. These are the safety violation reports Margaret was going to bring to federal authorities. Look at this memo about brake failures. Morrison studied the papers with growing amazement, his weathered face reflecting the magnitude of what he was seeing. Sweet Mary and Joseph, this is enough to bring down the entire Chicago and Northwestern Board of Directors. It gets worse. Look at this correspondence about Inspector Clark. As Morrison read through the materials, his expression grew increasingly grim. Thomas, if even half of this is accurate, we're looking at a conspiracy that goes far beyond simple negligence. This is murder. I think Margaret and Inspector Clark were killed because they threatened to expose the truth. And I think Margaret's ghost is trying to finish what she started. Morrison looked up sharply. Her ghost? Thomas, you've been working too hard. Dead people don't... Look at this photograph. Thomas showed him the print from Union Station. That's Margaret Whitmore, standing among the living passengers 6 months after her burial. Morrison examined the image closely, his skepticism gradually giving way to confusion and unease. This is some kind of trick photography. Double exposure, perhaps. I developed this plate myself, Jim. There's no trickery involved. Margaret appeared at the station and spoke to me, then vanished when I tried to approach her. Thomas, listen to yourself. You're talking about supernatural nonsense. Am I? Look at the evidence she left behind. Look at the pattern of deaths surrounding this investigation. Maybe the supernatural is the only way truth can survive when powerful men are determined to bury it. Morrison set down the photograph and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked streets. Even if I believed you about the ghost, which I'm not saying I do, we can't publish a story based on spectral evidence. We need corroboration, living witnesses, additional documentation. Then we'll find them. But we have to be careful. If Margaret and Clark were murdered for what they knew, we could be next. Morrison turned back to Thomas, his face grave. You're serious about this? You really believe Margaret Whitmore's spirit is guiding this investigation? I believe in justice, Jim, and sometimes justice requires allies from unexpected places. They worked through the night, cross-referencing Margaret's documents with Tribune archives and city records. A pattern emerged of accidents, near misses, and mysterious deaths that all connected to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad safety violations. The company had been systematically covering up mechanical failures for years, bribing inspectors and intimidating witnesses to maintain their profitable but deadly operations. As dawn broke over the city, Thomas made a disturbing discovery. The railway company's board of directors included several prominent Chicago businessmen who had significant investments in other industries throughout the city. Their influence extended far beyond transportation. They controlled banks, manufacturing companies, and even had connections to the police department and city government. This explains why Margaret's investigation was so dangerous, Thomas observed. She wasn't just threatening one company's profits. She was exposing a network of corruption that could bring down some of Chicago's most powerful men. Morrison nodded grimly. And now, we're carrying on her work. The question is, are we brave enough to see it through? Their answer came sooner than expected. As they prepared to leave the office that morning, a well-dressed stranger approached Thomas on the street outside the Tribune building. The man was tall and thin, with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mr. Hartford, I'm Robert Blackwood, representing certain business interests in this city. I understand you've been asking questions about railway safety matters. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. I'm a photographer, Mr. Blackwood. I ask questions about many things. Of course, but some questions can be hazardous to one's health. I'm sure you understand. A young photographer with a promising career wouldn't want to risk everything chasing stories that might not be in the public interest. And what determines the public interest, Mr. Blackwood? The man's smile was thin and predatory. Wise men, Mr. Hartford. Men who understand that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions. Men who know that dwelling on past tragedies can prevent a city from moving forward. Is that what happened to Margaret Whitmore? She dwelt too much on past tragedies. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Thomas caught a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Miss Whitmore was a troubled young woman who met with an unfortunate accident. I would hate to see other promising young people suffer similar misfortunes. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had issued such warnings before. Thomas realized that Margaret's enemies were still active, still powerful, and still willing to kill to protect their secrets. I'll consider your advice, Mr. Blackwood. I hope you will, Mr. Hartford. I truly hope you will. As Blackwood disappeared into the morning crowd, Thomas understood that the investigation had entered a new and deadly phase. Margaret's ghost had led him to the truth, but the living guardians of that truth's buried secrets were prepared to add his name to their list of silenced witnesses. The battle between justice and corruption was about to become very personal, and Thomas was no longer certain whether he was fighting for the living or the dead. That evening, Thomas returned to his hotel room with Blackwood's threat echoing in his mind like a funeral bell. The Palmer house, which had seemed luxurious and secure just days before, now felt exposed and vulnerable. Every shadow in the gaslit corridors could conceal an assassin. Every footstep in the hallway might herald his doom. He had barely settled at his writing desk to transcribe notes from Margaret's documents when the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath became visible in sudden puffs of vapor, and the gas flames in their wall sconces flickered as if touched by an invisible wind. Thomas looked up from his papers to find Margaret Whitmore standing beside his window, her form more solid and defined than it had been at the railway station. She wore the same dark traveling dress, but now he could see details that had been obscured before: the delicate lace at her throat, the small pearl buttons running down her bodice, the way her hair was pinned with obvious care despite her supernatural state. "You found my evidence," she said, her voice carrying the same cultured tones he remembered, but with an ethereal quality that seemed to emanate from the very air around her. Thomas fought down his initial terror, reminding himself that Margaret had been a kind woman in life and showed no signs of malevolent intent in death. "Miss Whitmore, your sister Catherine gave me your documents. They prove everything you suspected about the railway company." Margaret moved closer, her footsteps making no sound on the wooden floor. "They killed Benjamin Clark because he wouldn't falsify his reports. They arranged my accident because I had gathered too much evidence, and they will kill you if you continue this investigation." "Then why are you asking me to continue? Why not let the dead rest in peace?" Margaret's expression grew intense, her eyes blazing with an inner fire that transcended the physical world. "Because they're planning another accident, Thomas, a much larger one. The new express service to Milwaukee uses the same faulty brake systems that killed me, but now they're carrying 3 times as many passengers." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water. "When?" "Soon. Within days. They know that federal investigators are finally taking notice of the safety complaints. They plan to stage one final accident that will eliminate the remaining witnesses and provide cover for implementing new safety measures that should have been in place years ago." "What witnesses?" "Catherine, for one. She's been marked for death since you visited her. They know she has copies of my evidence." Thomas leaped to his feet, knocking over his chair in his haste. "We have to warn her." "It may already be too late, but Thomas, you must understand. I can only manifest when the veil between worlds grows thin, during times of great emotion, near scenes of violent death, in places where the boundary between life and death has been weakened. My ability to help you is limited." "Then how can we stop them?" Margaret's form began to waver slightly, as if she were struggling to maintain her connection to the physical world. "The brake systems on the new express trains are controlled from a central switching station near the Lake Forest Depot. If someone were to document the mechanical failures there, photograph the evidence of sabotage, you want me to break into a railway facility? I want you to expose the truth before more innocent people die, the same truth I died trying to reveal." As Margaret spoke, the hotel room grew even colder, and Thomas could see frost forming on the window panes despite the October weather. The supernatural energy required for her manifestation was drawing warmth from the very environment around them. "There's something else," Margaret continued, her voice growing fainter. "Inspector Clark didn't die in an accidental fire. Before they killed him, he hid additional evidence in his office at the railway depot. Evidence that proves the conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of city government." "Where in his office?" "Behind a false panel in his desk. Look for the initials MW carved into the wood. He was going to turn the evidence over to me the day after I died." Margaret's form was becoming increasingly translucent, the effort of maintaining her presence clearly taxing her supernatural strength. "Thomas, promise me something. No matter what happens to you, make sure the truth reaches the federal authorities. Don't let them silence the story the way they silenced me." "I promise, Margaret. But how will I know if you're trying to communicate with me again?" "Watch for signs. Cold spots where none should exist. Photographs that show more than they should. And listen for my voice in the wind. The dead can speak to those who know how to hear." With those words, Margaret's ghostly form dissolved like morning mist, leaving Thomas alone in a hotel room that slowly returned to normal temperature. The only evidence of her supernatural visit was the frost on the windows and the lingering scent of roses, the same perfume she had worn in life. Thomas sat heavily on his bed, his mind reeling from the implications of Margaret's warning. Catherine was in danger, possibly already dead. A major railway accident was being planned that would kill dozens of innocent passengers, and somewhere in Inspector Clark's abandoned office lay evidence that could expose the full scope of the conspiracy. He had 3 choices: flee Chicago and abandon the investigation, continue working through normal channels and hope the authorities would act in time, or take the dangerous step of breaking into railway property to gather the evidence Margaret's ghost had described. The decision was made easier by a sudden commotion in the hotel corridor outside his room. Thomas opened his door to find a bellboy running toward the stairs, his face pale with excitement. "What's happening?" Thomas called out. "Fire in Evanston, sir. Big house fire on Maple Street. They say a woman was trapped inside, couldn't get out in time." Thomas's heart clenched with dread. Maple Street was where Margaret Whitmore lived. Margaret's warning had come too late. Her sister was already dead, another victim of the railway company's ruthless determination to bury the truth along with anyone who threatened to expose it. As Thomas grabbed his coat and camera equipment, preparing to race north to confirm his worst fears, he realized that Margaret's ghost had not appeared to ask for his help. She had appeared to warn him that he was next on the list of people who knew too much about the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad's deadly secrets. The supernatural and the criminal had merged into a single, terrifying reality, and Thomas found himself fighting battles on two fronts, against living conspirators who would kill to protect their profits, and alongside a ghostly ally whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the persistence of justice beyond the grave. Outside his window, the October wind howled through the streets of Chicago like the voices of all the unavenged dead, and Thomas understood that Margaret Whitmore's spirit would not rest until her killers faced the justice that had been denied her in life. The train to Evanston seemed to crawl through the night, each clacking wheel on the rails marking another moment that Thomas might have prevented Margaret Whitmore's death if he had acted faster. The passenger car was nearly empty at such a late hour, populated only by a few workers returning from evening shifts, and Thomas himself clutching his camera bag like a talisman against the growing dread in his chest. When he finally reached Maple Street, the acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air despite the rain that had been falling since afternoon. Catherine's cottage was a blackened skeleton against the night sky, its windows blown out and roof collapsed. Fire department horses stamped restlessly in the street, while uniformed men coiled their hoses and prepared to depart. Thomas approached the fire chief, a grizzled man whose soot-stained face spoke of long experience with Chicago's frequent blazes. "I'm from the Tribune. Was anyone hurt in the fire?" The chief nodded grimly. "One fatality. Young woman who lived alone. Neighbors say they heard her screaming from inside, but the flames spread too fast for us to reach her." "What started the fire?" "Looks like a lamp got knocked over in the front parlor. These old houses go up like tinder once the flames take hold." The chief's voice carried the weary resignation of someone who had seen too many similar tragedies. Thomas studied the wreckage, his photographer's eye noting details that didn't quite fit the official explanation. The pattern of burning seemed concentrated in specific areas rather than spreading naturally from a single source. Moreover, the front door appeared to have been damaged from the outside, as if someone had forced entry before the fire began. "Chief, did you find any evidence of accelerants? The burn pattern looks unusually intense." The fire chief's expression grew guarded. "Now, why would a newspaper photographer be asking about accelerants? This was an accident, plain and simple. I'm just trying to understand what happened. Miss Whitmore was a friend of mine." "Then you have my condolences, son. But there's nothing suspicious here, just a tragic accident that could have happened to anyone." Thomas sensed that further questions would only arouse suspicion, so he thanked the chief and began photographing the scene. As he worked, neighbors gathered to share their memories of Catherine and their theories about the fire's cause. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who lived in the house next door, proved particularly observant. "I saw two men leaving Catherine's house just before the flames started," she whispered to Thomas, while the fire chief was distracted. "Well-dressed gentlemen in dark coats. They walked away very calmly, like they had finished some kind of business." "Did you recognize them?" "Never seen them before in this neighborhood, but they didn't look like the sort of men who usually visit school teachers. More like, well, like the type you see around the railway offices downtown." Thomas's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Catherine had been murdered, just as Margaret's ghost had warned. The railway conspiracy had claimed another victim, and Thomas himself was undoubtedly next on their list. As he prepared to leave Evanston, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Standing across the street from the burned cottage, partially concealed in the shadows between two gas lamps, was the unmistakable figure of Margaret Whitmore. Her ghostly form was more translucent than it had been in his hotel room, but her presence was unmistakable. Thomas approached cautiously, aware that the neighbors might think him mad if they saw him apparently talking to empty air. "Margaret, I'm so sorry about Catherine." Margaret's spectral voice carried a note of infinite sadness. She died trying to preserve my evidence. They tortured her before setting the fire, forced her to tell them where she had hidden the documents. Did they find everything? No, Catherine was cleverer than they realized. She had made additional copies and hidden them in a place they would never think to look. Where? Our parents' grave at Graceland Cemetery. She hollowed out a space beneath our mother's headstone and sealed the documents in a metal box. She told me about it during her last visit to my grave, when she came to leave fresh flowers. Thomas felt a surge of hope. If Catherine had preserved copies of Margaret's evidence, there might still be a chance to expose the railway conspiracy. Can you show me where? I can try, but my strength is fading. Manifesting so far from the sites of violent death requires enormous energy, and I may not be able to maintain physical form much longer. As if to emphasize her point, Margaret's ghostly figure began to flicker like a candle flame in the wind. Thomas, you must understand. They know you're investigating. After tonight, they'll move quickly to eliminate you and implement their final plan. The railway accident you mentioned? Tomorrow night, the Midnight Express to Milwaukee. They've sabotaged the brake systems and arranged for the train to derail at the same curve where I died. Over 100 passengers will perish, and the accident will provide cover for implementing new safety measures while eliminating the few remaining witnesses who could connect the deaths to deliberate sabotage. Thomas felt sick with horror. We have to warn the authorities. With what proof? The police are in the railway company's pocket, and federal investigators won't arrive until next week. By then, it will be too late. Margaret's form was becoming increasingly indistinct, her supernatural energy clearly waning. There's only one way to stop them, Thomas. You must photograph the evidence at the Lake Forest switching station tonight, before they have a chance to remove the sabotaged equipment. Document everything, then get the photographs to federal authorities in Washington. And if I don't survive the attempt, then my sister and I will have died for nothing, and 100 innocent souls will join us in death tomorrow night. With those words, Margaret's ghostly presence faded completely, leaving Thomas alone in the rain-soaked street, with the smell of smoke and the weight of impossible responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had less than 24 hours to gather evidence, expose a conspiracy, and prevent a mass murder that would make Margaret's death seem like a minor tragedy by comparison. The dead were counting on him to finish what they had started, but the living were prepared to kill him to protect their deadly secrets. As Thomas made his way back to the train station, he realized that his investigation had evolved beyond journalism into something approaching a crusade. Margaret Whitmore's ghost had made him the instrument of justice for all the railway company's victims, and failure would mean not just his own death, but the loss of countless innocent lives. The Midnight Express was scheduled to depart Chicago in exactly 18 hours, carrying its passengers toward a carefully orchestrated disaster. Thomas had that long to become either a hero or another ghost, haunting the sites where corporate greed had claimed its victims. In the distance, thunder rumbled across Lake Michigan like the sound of an approaching train, and Thomas wondered if he was hearing the echo of tomorrow night's tragedy, or simply the voice of God lamenting the price of human ambition. Dawn was breaking over Chicago when Thomas returned from Evanston, but he had no time for rest. If Margaret's ghost had spoken truly, he had only hours before the railway company executed their deadly plan. His first priority was retrieving the hidden evidence from Graceland Cemetery, assuming Catherine had indeed managed to preserve copies of her sister's damning documentation. The cemetery gates opened at sunrise, their iron scrollwork gleaming with morning dew that seemed almost crystalline in the pale light. Thomas made his way through the winding paths with the familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time among the dead in recent days. The October air carried a sharp chill that reminded him of Margaret's supernatural presence, as if the very atmosphere was charged with ghostly energy. He found the Whitmore family plot in the cemetery's older section, where weathered headstones marked the graves of Chicago's earlier residents. The parents' monument was a modest granite marker inscribed with the names William and Mary Whitmore and dates spanning the mid-19th century. Margaret's own grave lay nearby, still adorned with the wilted flowers Thomas had noticed during his previous visit. Kneeling beside Mary Whitmore's headstone, Thomas began examining the base for signs of disturbance. At first, the ground appeared undisturbed, but closer inspection revealed subtle indications that someone had recently worked the soil. Using a small trowel he had brought for this purpose, Thomas began carefully excavating around the monument's foundation. After several minutes of delicate work, his tool struck something metallic. With growing excitement, He uncovered a small tin box, its surface corroded but intact. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were copies of all the documents Catherine had shown him, plus additional materials he had never seen. The new evidence was even more damning than Margaret's original compilation. It included correspondence, proving that city officials had been bribed to ignore safety violations, insurance documents showing that the railway company had secretly increased their liability, coverage in anticipation of major accidents, and most shocking of all, a detailed schedule of planned mechanical failures designed to eliminate witnesses and create the appearance of random tragedies. One document made Thomas's hands tremble as he read it. Dated just 3 days earlier, it was a memo from Robert Blackwood, the same man who had threatened Thomas outside the Tribune offices, to the railway company's board of directors. The subject line read, "Final Phase Implementation, Midnight Express Incident." The memo outlined the complete plan for tomorrow night's disaster. The brake systems on the Midnight Express had been deliberately weakened at specific stress points, designed to fail catastrophically at the Lake Forest curve where Margaret had died. The derailment would eliminate the last remaining witnesses to the company's safety violations, while providing justification for implementing expensive new safety measures that should have been installed years earlier. Most chilling of all, the memo included a passenger manifest with specific names marked for elimination. Thomas's own name appeared on the list, along with several federal investigators, 2 newspaper reporters, and a handful of former railway employees who had expressed concerns about safety practices. "Sweet Mother of God," Thomas whispered, understanding the full scope of the conspiracy for the first time. This wasn't just corporate negligence or even murder for profit. It was a systematic campaign of assassination disguised as industrial accidents. As he carefully repacked the evidence, Thomas became aware of a subtle change in the cemetery's atmosphere. The morning air grew noticeably colder, and the shadows between the headstones seemed to deepen despite the strengthening sunlight. He looked up to find Margaret's ghostly form materializing beside her own grave, her expression urgent and fearful. "They're coming," she said, her spectral voice carrying a note of desperate warning. Blackwood's men discovered that Catherine had visited the cemetery repeatedly. They're searching every grave in the family plot. Thomas looked toward the cemetery entrance and saw 3 dark figures making their way purposefully along the main path. Even at a distance, their bearing suggested violence and grim determination. "How long do I have?" "Minutes at most." "But Thomas, there's something else you must know. The Lake Forest switching station isn't just where they've sabotaged the brake systems, it's where they're planning to eliminate you tonight." "What do you mean?" Margaret's form flickered as her supernatural energy struggled against the approaching dawn. "They know you're investigating. They expect you to try to gather evidence at the switching station, and they've prepared a trap. You'll die there, and your death will be blamed on another industrial accident." "Then how can I stop the Midnight Express disaster?" "There's another way. The brake control systems for all northbound trains are managed from a central switching house near Union Station. If you could disable those controls, no trains could leave Chicago tomorrow night." Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. But that would affect all railway traffic, not just the express. Better to strand passengers in Chicago than let them die in a planned derailment. Sometimes preventing a greater evil requires accepting a lesser one. The approaching figures were closer now, close enough that Thomas could see they carried weapons beneath their coats. Margaret's ghostly presence was fading as the morning light strengthened, her connection to the physical world weakening with each passing moment. "I have to go," Thomas said, carefully securing the metal box inside his coat. "Will I see you again? If you succeed in stopping their plan, I may finally find peace. If you fail..." Margaret's voice trailed off as her form dissolved completely, leaving only the faint scent of roses and the echo of supernatural warning. Thomas slipped away from the Whitmore plot through the cemetery's back paths, using his knowledge of the grounds to avoid the searching killers. As he made his way toward the main gate, he could hear voices calling to each other among the headstones, the frustrated sounds of predators who had arrived too late to catch their prey. Once safely beyond the cemetery walls, Thomas realized that his investigation had reached a crucial turning point. He possessed irrefutable evidence of the railway conspiracy, but using that evidence would require him to survive long enough to present it to authorities who weren't already corrupted by railway money. Margaret's ghost had given him a choice: attempt to gather more evidence at the Lake Forest switching station and almost certainly die in the trap that awaited him there, or take the desperate measure of sabotaging Chicago's entire northbound railway system to prevent the Midnight Express. From departing, either choice carried enormous risks and the potential for failure, but as Thomas made his way through Chicago's awakening streets, carrying the testimony of the dead in his coat pocket, he understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Margaret Whitmore and her sister Catherine had died trying to prevent the railway company's murderous plans. Now it fell to Thomas to finish their work, guided by a ghost's warnings and armed with evidence purchased with innocent blood. The clock on the Tribune building showed 8 in the morning when Thomas passed beneath its shadow. In 16 hours, the Midnight Express would depart for Milwaukee unless someone found the courage to stop it. The dead were counting on him, and the living remained blissfully unaware that their lives hung in the balance between justice and profit, between the courage of one man and the ruthless ambition of many. Thomas quickened his pace, knowing that his next decision would determine whether Margaret Whitmore's spirit finally found peace or joined the ranks of unavenged ghosts haunting Chicago's blood-soaked streets. Thomas burst into the Tribune offices with the urgency of a man carrying news of war. The morning bustle of reporters and typesetters seemed almost surreal, given the magnitude of the conspiracy he had uncovered. James Morrison looked up from his desk with surprise as Thomas approached, clutching the metal box from the cemetery like a sacred relic. "Jim, we need to contact federal authorities immediately. I have evidence of a planned railway disaster that will kill over 100 people tonight." Morrison's weathered face showed skepticism mixed with concern. "Thomas, slow down. What kind of evidence?" Thomas opened the metal box and spread Catherine's preserved documents across Morrison's desk. As the editor read through the materials, his expression grew increasingly grave. The memo about the Midnight Express disaster seemed to drain the color from his face entirely. "Dear God in heaven, this is a death warrant for everyone on that train, including several federal investigators who've been asking questions about railway safety. The company plans to eliminate them along with the other witnesses." Morrison reached for his telephone, a modern contraption that still drew curious stares from visitors to the newspaper. "I'm calling Washington immediately. The Interstate Commerce Commission needs to see this evidence." As Morrison placed his call, Thomas studied the passenger manifest one more time. The names marked for elimination read like a roll call of everyone who had threatened the railway company's conspiracy. Federal investigators, newspaper reporters, former employees with knowledge of safety violations, and even some passengers who had complained publicly about dangerous conditions on previous trips. "Morrison here, Chicago Tribune," the editor spoke into the telephone's mouthpiece. "I need to speak with Commissioner Harrison immediately. We have evidence of a planned railway disaster." "What do you mean he's not available?" "This is a matter of life and death." Thomas watched with growing dread as Morrison's conversation continued. The federal bureaucracy that should have been their salvation seemed mired in red tape and jurisdictional disputes. By the time officials in Washington decided to act, the Midnight Express would already be lying in twisted wreckage at the bottom of Lake Forest Ravine. "They're transferring me to someone in the Railway Safety Division," Morrison whispered, covering the mouthpiece. "But it could take hours to reach the right person with authority to stop the train." A new voice entered the conversation, and Thomas could hear shouting from the other end of the line. Morrison's face went pale as he listened to whatever the federal official was telling him. "What is it?" Thomas demanded. Morrison hung up the telephone with shaking hands. "The Railway Safety Division has been investigating the Chicago and Northwestern for months. They were planning to make arrests next week, but someone leaked information about the federal investigation." "What does that mean?" "It means the railway company knows they're about to be exposed. Tonight's disaster isn't just about eliminating witnesses. It's their final desperate attempt to destroy evidence and escape justice." Thomas felt the weight of inevitability settling over him like a burial shroud. "Then we're the only ones who can stop them." "Thomas, we're newspaper men, not lawmen. What can we possibly do against a conspiracy this vast?" Before Thomas could answer, a commotion erupted in the newsroom outside Morrison's office. Through the glass partition, they could see several men in dark coats moving purposefully through the maze of desks, clearly searching for someone. Thomas recognized one of them immediately, Robert Blackwood, the man who had threatened him yesterday. "They've found us," Thomas whispered. Morrison quickly gathered the documents from his desk and thrust them into Thomas's hands. "There's a back stairway that leads to the alley. Take these and get to the railway switching house. It's the only way to stop that train. What about you?" "I'll delay them as long as possible. Go, Thomas, make Margaret's sacrifice mean something." Thomas clutched the evidence to his chest and slipped out the back door of Morrison's office, just as Blackwood's men reached the main entrance. The rear stairway was narrow and dimly lit, but it provided the escape route he desperately needed. As he descended toward the alley, Thomas could hear voices raised in anger from the newsroom above. Morrison was putting up a valiant fight, denying any knowledge of Thomas's whereabouts, while the killers searched for evidence of their investigation. The alley behind the Tribune building reeked of garbage and industrial waste, but it offered concealment from the hunters who sought his life. Thomas made his way carefully toward the street, staying in the shadows cast by fire escapes and awnings. He had nearly reached the alley mouth when a figure stepped out of a doorway directly in front of him, one of Blackwood's men, positioned to cut off any escape attempt. The man's hand moved toward his coat, clearly reaching for a weapon. "Mr. Hartford, you've caused us considerable trouble." Thomas backed away slowly, his mind racing for some means of escape. The alley was a dead end behind him, with only the narrow stairway leading back to the Tribune offices where more killers waited. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted with supernatural intensity. Frost began forming on the brick walls around them, and the man's breath became visible in sharp puffs of vapor. Thomas felt a familiar presence behind him, and when he turned, Margaret's ghostly form was materializing with greater solidity than he had ever seen before. "Run, Thomas!" her spectral voice commanded with otherworldly authority. The gunman stared in shock at Margaret's appearance, his weapon forgotten as primal terror overwhelmed his criminal resolve. What in hell? Margaret's ghost stepped toward the man, her form radiating cold energy that seemed to leach warmth from the very air. "You killed my sister. You killed Inspector Clark, and now you plan to murder 100 innocent passengers." The gunman's courage cracked completely. He turned and fled from the alley, his footsteps echoing off the brick walls as he ran toward the street. Margaret's presence faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Thomas alone with the lingering scent of roses and the knowledge that supernatural intervention had saved his life. He emerged from the alley to find chaos on Madison Street. Morrison had apparently set off the fire alarm in the Tribune building, bringing fire departments and creating enough confusion to scatter Blackwood's men. In the midst of the emergency response, Thomas was able to slip away unnoticed. As he made his way toward Union Station and the railway switching house, Thomas understood that Margaret's ghost was growing stronger as the moment of crisis approached. The approaching disaster was somehow feeding her supernatural energy, allowing her to manifest with increasing power and clarity. But even ghostly allies might not be enough to stop a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Chicago's power structure. The Midnight Express was scheduled to depart in less than 12 hours, carrying its doomed passengers toward a carefully orchestrated death. Thomas quickened his pace through the city streets, knowing that he was racing against time, corporate assassins, and the inexorable machinery of a railway system designed to serve profit rather than human life. Margaret Whitmore's spirit had saved him once, but the battle between justice and corruption was far from over. The switching house loomed ahead like a fortress of iron and steam, holding within its mechanical heart the power to prevent mass murder or ensure it. Thomas approached with the evidence of the dead in his pocket and the prayers of the living on his lips, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether Margaret's ghost finally found peace or gained the company of 100 new spirits crying out for justice in the Chicago night. The railway switching house stood like a mechanical cathedral in the industrial district near Union Station, its brick walls rising 3 stories above a maze of iron tracks and signal towers. Steam hissed constantly from various pipes and valves, creating an atmosphere that seemed perpetually shrouded in fog. Thomas approached the facility with the caution of a man entering enemy territory, knowing that his presence here would likely trigger the final confrontation between Margaret's quest for justice and the railway company's determination to bury the truth. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the rail yards, providing cover as Thomas studied the switching house's defenses. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter with the discipline of military sentries, their presence confirming that the railway company expected trouble. These weren't ordinary security men. They moved with the professional bearing of hired killers who had been well compensated for their deadly services. Thomas circled the facility twice before identifying a possible entry point. A service tunnel used for running steam pipes beneath the building appeared unguarded, perhaps because the company's security focused on more obvious approaches. The tunnel entrance was partially concealed behind a pile of coal and iron fixtures, accessible through a maintenance yard that bordered the main switching house. As evening approached, Thomas made his move. The shift change at 6 o'clock provided a brief window of confusion as day workers departed and night crews arrived. He slipped through the maintenance yard's gate during this transition, keeping low behind equipment and using the constant noise of railway operations to mask his movements. The service tunnel was cramped and filled with the oppressive heat of steam pipes, but it led directly beneath the switching house's main floor. Thomas crawled through the narrow space, guided by the sound of machinery and voices above. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he found a maintenance access that opened into the building's basement. The basement level housed the mechanical systems that controlled railway operations throughout the Chicago area. Massive switches and signal mechanisms filled the space, their iron arms moving with clockwork precision as they directed the flow of trains across the city's expanding network. Thomas realized that this single building controlled the movement of thousands of passengers every day, making it a nexus of both transportation and potential catastrophe. He climbed a service ladder to the main floor, where he could observe the switching house's operations through gaps in the machinery. The night crew consisted of perhaps a dozen men, most focused on their routine duties of managing train schedules and signal systems, but Thomas noticed several guards positioned strategically throughout the facility, their attention directed toward the entrances rather than the technical operations. In the center of the main floor stood the master control panel for northbound railway traffic. A series of mechanical switches and electrical circuits determined which trains could depart Chicago and which routes they would follow. Thomas studied the system with growing understanding. If he could disable the correct circuits, no trains would be able to leave for Milwaukee until repairs were completed. But the control panel was positioned in full view of the night crew, making sabotage extremely dangerous. Thomas would need a distraction that would draw attention away from the critical systems long enough for him to disable the northbound circuits. As he pondered his options, the temperature around him began to drop with familiar supernatural intensity. Margaret's ghostly presence was manifesting again, her form materializing in the shadows beside the machinery where Thomas crouched. "The Midnight Express is being prepared on track 7, she whispered, her spectral voice barely audible above the mechanical noise. "They've made final adjustments to the brake systems, ensuring catastrophic failure at precisely the right location. Can you create a distraction? Something to draw the guards away from the control panel?" Margaret's ghostly form flickered with what might have been determination. "I can try, but manifesting physical effects requires enormous energy. I may only be able to maintain the distraction for a few minutes. That might be enough. Thomas, you must understand, if I expend all my supernatural energy tonight, I may not be able to return. This could be our final opportunity to stop them. Then we make it count." Margaret's ghost moved toward the far end of the switching house, her form growing more solid as she concentrated her otherworldly power. Thomas watched in fascination as she approached a bank of electrical switches that controlled the building's lighting systems. Suddenly, every electric bulb in the facility exploded simultaneously in a shower of sparks and broken glass. The switching house plunged into darkness, except for the glow of coal fires and the flickering light from signal lamps outside. Shouts of alarm erupted from the night crew as they struggled to understand what had caused such a massive electrical failure. "Check the main generator," someone called out. "Could be sabotage," another voice replied. In the confusion that followed, guards rushed toward the electrical systems while workers scrambled to restore lighting using emergency lanterns. Thomas seized the opportunity to reach the master control panel, his photographer's training helping him navigate the darkened facility by memory and instinct. The northbound circuit controls were clearly labeled, a series of heavy switches that governed the flow of electrical signals to track systems leading out of Chicago. Thomas began throwing switches methodically, disrupting the circuits that would allow trains to depart for Milwaukee, Madison, and other northern destinations. As he worked, he could hear Margaret's ghostly voice growing fainter, her supernatural energy clearly waning from the effort of disrupting the electrical systems. "The passenger manifest," she whispered urgently. "In the station master's office, you must photograph it as evidence." Thomas completed his sabotage of the control circuits just as emergency lighting began to illuminate the switching house. He had perhaps minutes before the night crew discovered the damaged systems and began repairs. Moving quickly through the mechanical maze, he found the stairway leading to the administrative offices on the upper floor. The station master's office was unlocked, its occupant presumably dealing with the electrical emergency below. Thomas found the passenger manifest for the Midnight Express lying on the desk, along with detailed schedule information and routing instructions. He quickly set up his camera and photographed the documents, capturing evidence that would prove the railway company's planning for the deliberately planned disaster. As he prepared to leave, Thomas discovered additional documents that made his blood run cold. Detailed maps showing the exact location where the derailment was planned, engineering calculations proving that the brake failures had been precisely calibrated, and most damning of all, insurance policies taken out on specific passengers marked for elimination. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The railway company had not simply planned an accident, they had engineered a mass murder disguised as mechanical failure, complete with financial incentives that would compensate them for their victims' deaths. Thomas photographed everything, working frantically as voices and footsteps approached the office. Through the window, he could see that his sabotage had been successful. Trains were backing up on the tracks leading out of Chicago, as confused engineers received conflicting signals from the damaged control systems. But his victory might be temporary. Even as he watched, repair crews were arriving to restore the electrical circuits he had damaged. The railway company's resources were vast, and they would spare no expense to ensure that the Midnight Express departed on schedule. As Thomas prepared to escape through the office window, he heard Margaret's voice one final time, so faint it might have been his imagination. "The truth is in your hands now. Make sure it reaches those who can stop them." Looking back at the switching house as he slipped away into the Chicago night, Thomas realized that Margaret's ghost had sacrificed her remaining supernatural energy to give him this opportunity. She might have found peace at last, her unfinished business finally completed through his actions. But the battle was far from over. Thomas carried photographic evidence that could expose the conspiracy, but he still faced the challenge of surviving long enough to present it to authorities who weren't corrupted by railway money. The Midnight Express might be delayed, but the killers who served the railway company would not give up easily. As church bells throughout Chicago chimed the hour of 9 o'clock, Thomas understood that he had 3 hours to ensure that justice finally prevailed over the forces that had murdered Margaret Whitmore, her sister Catherine, Inspector Clark, and countless other victims of corporate greed. Thomas emerged from the railway yards to find Chicago transformed into a city under siege. Word of the switching house sabotage had spread quickly, and railway company security forces were conducting a systematic search of the surrounding neighborhoods. Armed men moved through the streets with the authority of martial law, stopping pedestrians and searching buildings with military precision. He made his way carefully through back alleys and side streets, carrying the photographic evidence of the conspiracy in a leather satchel that felt heavier with each step. The weight wasn't physical. It was the accumulated burden of all the lives that depended on his ability to reach federal authorities before the railway company could restore their systems and proceed with their murderous plan. As Thomas approached the Palmer House Hotel, hoping to retrieve additional equipment from his room, he spotted familiar figures waiting in the lobby. Robert Blackwood stood near the front desk with 2 companions, their positions suggesting a carefully planned ambush. The railway company had anticipated his movements and prepared accordingly. Thomas retreated to a nearby alley to consider his options. The hotel was compromised, the Tribune offices were certainly under surveillance, and he had no way of knowing which local authorities might be in the railway company's employ. His situation seemed hopeless until he remembered Margaret's final words about federal investigators already in Chicago. If the Railway Safety Division had been investigating the Chicago and Northwestern for months, their agents might still be in the city, despite the leak that had compromised their operation. Thomas recalled seeing references to federal investigators in the passenger manifest for the Midnight Express, men marked for elimination because their ongoing investigation threatened the conspiracy. The challenge was locating these federal agents before the railway company's killers found him. Thomas made his way toward the financial district, reasoning that federal investigators would likely be staying in establishments that offered both luxury and security. The Union Club, Chicago's most exclusive men's establishment, seemed a logical choice for government officials conducting sensitive investigations. As he approached the club's imposing facade, Thomas noticed increased activity around the building. Well-dressed men moved with purposeful urgency, their bearing suggesting federal authority rather than local influence. Some carried briefcases and official-looking documents, while others displayed the alert watchfulness of experienced lawmen. Thomas approached the club's doorman, a distinguished man whose formal attire couldn't quite conceal the bulge of a concealed weapon. "I need to speak with the federal investigators staying here. I have evidence related to the railway safety investigation." The doorman studied Thomas with professional skepticism. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, sir. Perhaps you have the wrong establishment. Tell them it's about the Midnight Express and the planned derailment at Lake Forest. Tell them Margaret Whitmore's ghost led me to the evidence they need." The doorman's expression shifted from skepticism to sharp attention at the mention of Margaret's name. "Wait here, sir. Don't move from this spot." Within minutes, Thomas found himself face to face with 3 federal agents whose credentials identified them as senior investigators for the Interstate Commerce Commission. Commissioner Harrison himself was among them, a gray-haired man whose weathered face spoke of long experience with corporate corruption and industrial violence. "Mr. Hartford, we've been hoping to speak with you. We understand you've been investigating the Chicago and Northwestern safety violations." Thomas opened his leather satchel and spread the photographic evidence across a table in the club's private meeting room. As the federal agents examined the documents, their expressions grew increasingly grave. "This is extraordinary," Commissioner Harrison murmured, studying the passenger manifest with its marked names. "They were planning to eliminate our entire investigative team along with the other witnesses." "How did you obtain these documents?" asked Agent Reynolds, a younger man whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Thomas explained his investigation, from Margaret's ghostly appearance in his photograph through the discoveries at Graceland Cemetery and the evidence preserved by Catherine Whitmore. He described the switching house sabotage that had temporarily disabled the railway's northbound systems. "You're telling us that a ghost guided this investigation?" Agent Morrison seemed skeptical. "I'm telling you that Margaret Whitmore's spirit wouldn't rest while her killers remained free. Whether you believe in supernatural intervention or remarkable coincidences, the evidence speaks for itself." Commissioner Harrison studied the insurance documents with particular interest. "These policies prove premeditation. The railway company expected to profit from their passengers' deaths." "Can you stop the Midnight Express?" Thomas asked. "We already have. Federal marshals are stationed at Union Station with orders to prevent any northbound departures until our investigation is complete. Your sabotage of the switching house bought us the time we needed to take official action." Thomas felt a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. The immediate crisis was over, but questions remained about the full scope of the conspiracy and the fate of those responsible. What happens to Blackwood and the railway executives? They'll face federal charges for conspiracy, murder, and violation of interstate commerce laws. The evidence you've provided ensures that justice will finally be served. As the federal agents continued their review of the documents, Thomas became aware of a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. The temperature dropped slightly, and he caught the faint scent of roses that had become so familiar during his supernatural encounters with Margaret. Looking toward the window, Thomas saw a translucent figure standing in the gaslight from the street below. Margaret Whitmore's ghost appeared one final time, her form peaceful and serene, in a way he had never seen before. She smiled and nodded once, a gesture of gratitude and farewell that transcended the boundary between life and death. Then she faded away completely, leaving only the lingering fragrance of roses and the sense that a great burden had finally been lifted from the world. "Mr. Hartford," Commissioner Harrison was studying him with concern. "Are you all right?" "Yes, sir. I believe Margaret Whitmore has finally found the peace she was seeking." The federal agents exchanged glances that suggested they found Thomas's supernatural claims difficult to accept, but they could hardly argue with the results of his investigation. The evidence he had gathered would ensure that the railway conspiracy was exposed and its perpetrators brought to justice. As dawn broke over Chicago, Thomas realized that his extraordinary adventure was drawing to a close. The Midnight Express sat safely in Union Station, its passengers unaware of how close they had come to disaster. The switching house sabotage had been repaired, but under federal supervision rather than railway company control. Margaret Whitmore's ghost had guided him to the truth, and that truth would finally set her spirit free while protecting the innocent lives that corporate greed had threatened. Justice had prevailed over corruption, the dead had found peace, and the living could continue their journeys without fear of deliberately engineered disasters. But Thomas understood that he had been forever changed by his encounters with the supernatural realm where Margaret's spirit dwelt. He had learned that some battles transcend the boundary between life and death, and that the quest for justice sometimes requires allies from the most unexpected places. The story would make headlines throughout the nation, But Thomas knew that the most important reader would never see the newspapers. Margaret Whitmore's ghost had already received the only notification that mattered, the knowledge that her sacrifice had not been in vain, and that the truth she died trying to expose had finally been revealed to those with the power to act upon it. 6 months later, Thomas Hartford stood in the courtroom of the Federal District Court for Northern Illinois, watching as the final sentences were pronounced against the conspirators who had murdered Margaret Whitmore and planned the Midnight Express disaster. The trials had captured national attention, exposing a web of corruption that reached far beyond Chicago's railway system into the highest levels of corporate and political power. Robert Blackwood received life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit murder, his cold demeanor finally cracking as federal marshals led him away in chains. The railway company's board of directors faced similar sentences, their empire of greed finally brought to justice by the evidence that Margaret's ghost had helped Thomas uncover. The presiding judge, the Honorable William Taft, delivered his final remarks with the gravity befitting such a momentous case. The defendants in this matter sought to place profit above human life, treating innocent passengers as acceptable casualties in their pursuit of financial gain. Their crimes represent not merely corporate negligence, but premeditated murder on a scale that shocks the conscience of civilized society. As the courthouse emptied and the defendants were led away to federal prison, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. What had begun as a simple photography assignment had evolved into a supernatural investigation that challenged everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the persistence of justice beyond the grave. The photographs he had taken at Union Station, including the image that first revealed Margaret's ghostly presence, now hung in the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibition on industrial safety and the fight against corporate corruption. Margaret's spirit had become an inadvertent symbol of those who died trying to protect others from the consequences of unchecked greed. But for Thomas, the most important victory was not the public recognition or the legal justice that had finally been served. It was the knowledge that Margaret Whitmore's spirit had found the peace that had eluded her in death, her unfinished business finally completed through their supernatural partnership. He had not seen Margaret's ghost since that final night at the Union Club, when she had appeared to acknowledge that her quest for justice was complete. The absence of her spectral presence brought its own form of comfort, proof that she had indeed found rest after months of supernatural struggle against the forces that had silenced her in life. Thomas walked through Chicago's streets in the late afternoon sunlight, noting how much the city had changed since the railway conspiracy's exposure. Federal safety regulations now governed all interstate transportation. Regular inspections prevented the kind of mechanical sabotage that had killed Margaret, and corporate executives faced real consequences for endangering public safety. The Tribune had awarded Thomas a promotion and a permanent position as chief investigative photographer, recognition for his role in exposing one of the century's most significant criminal conspiracies. But he had declined the offer, choosing instead to establish an independent practice focused on documenting social injustice and corporate malfeasance. His work now carried a deeper purpose, informed by his understanding that some truths required supernatural intervention to reach the light of day. He had become, in effect, a photographer of both the visible and invisible worlds, capturing images that revealed hidden corruption while remaining alert to signs of otherworldly guidance. As evening approached, Thomas made his way to Graceland Cemetery for what had become a weekly ritual. Margaret's grave now bore a new headstone, installed by grateful federal authorities who recognized her sacrifice in preventing the Midnight Express disaster. Fresh flowers adorned the monument regularly, placed by survivors who understood that their lives had been saved by a dead woman's determination to seek justice. Thomas knelt beside the grave and placed his own bouquet of roses, the same variety whose scent had announced Margaret's supernatural presence during their months of collaboration. "Thank you, Margaret," he whispered to the silent stone, "for trusting me with your truth, for showing me that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the odds." The cemetery was peaceful in the gathering dusk, filled with the kind of tranquil silence that spoke of souls finally at rest. No supernatural chill marked Margaret's presence, no ghostly voice carried on the evening wind. Her spirit had moved on to whatever realm awaited those whose earthly business was complete. But as Thomas prepared to leave, he noticed something that made him smile with recognition. On Catherine Whitmore's nearby grave, someone had left a small camera, its brass fittings gleaming in the fading light. No note accompanied the gift, but Thomas understood its significance immediately. Margaret and Catherine had found peace, but their legacy lived on in the work of those who continued to fight against corruption and injustice. The camera was a symbol of that ongoing battle, a reminder that truth required constant vigilance and the courage to document what others preferred to keep hidden. Thomas picked up the camera and examined its construction, noting the craftsmanship of an earlier era when photographers were pioneers exploring uncharted territories of light and shadow. He would treasure this supernatural gift, using it in his continuing work to expose the darkness that thrived in the spaces between official truth and hidden reality. As he walked away from the cemetery, Thomas carried with him the knowledge that his life had been forever changed by his encounters with Margaret Whitmore's ghost. He had learned that justice sometimes required allies from beyond the grave, that the dead could be more determined than the living in their pursuit of truth, and that supernatural intervention might be the only force powerful enough to challenge earthly corruption. The Midnight Express now ran safely between Chicago and Milwaukee, its passengers unaware of how close they had once come to disaster. The railway yards hummed with activity under federal oversight, their operations governed by safety regulations, written in the blood of those who had died fighting for reform. And somewhere in the space between worlds, Margaret Whitmore's spirit rested in peace, her mission finally accomplished through the most unlikely partnership between the living and the dead. Her ghost had found justice, her killers had faced punishment, and her legacy lived on in the safety measures that protected future generations of travelers. Thomas returned to his hotel as the gas lamps flickered to life throughout Chicago, their warm glow illuminating a city that had been forever changed by one woman's refusal to let death silence her quest for truth. The supernatural had touched the natural world, justice had triumphed over corruption, and the dead had finally found peace. But Thomas knew that other spirits might someday need his help. Other injustices might require supernatural intervention to reach the light. He would be ready when that call came, armed with his camera and his hard-won understanding that the most important truths often existed in the shadows between life and death, waiting for someone brave enough to capture them and bring them into the light of day. The ghost of Margaret Whitmore had taught him that some battles transcend the grave, and that justice, once awakened, could prove more persistent than death itself.